about the whole journey, how you met the Dan during this time, or how you met the Kim Lewandowski. When this conversation started, when you're thinking about this own initiative of Chainguard.
Yeah, so it's funny. So like back in March, between the pandemic and, I'd been doing Knative for a while, and there's been, tension on and off in the community between, Google as well as the other participants around governance that, I don't know, I don't like to talk about it. It just makes me, around the idea of in the past, but I was sort of like, I hadn't really seriously thought about starting up because I always sort of appreciate the challenge of starting up. And I was like, I need a sort of CEO type. And I know that's not me, right? Like it's not who I am. I'm good at the technology, but like I need someone who's good at some of the...
Thanks everyone for joining us today on CloudNativeFM podcast. And today I'm joined by Matthew Moore. I think you all are already familiar with these guys on the KubeCon LA. I don't met him personally because of this travel restriction, but hopefully I will meet him sometime in the future. But I think this information is popping up in everybody's mind. The 5 people left the biggest companies and started their own setup, and the supply chain security invaded KubeCon LA this year. So I have been in the past. Dan Lawrence, the CEO of the Chainguard, has joined me, and he's to tell us a lot about the supply chain security, what it is, and why it is interesting right now. And today I'm another friend of him, Dan, and he's from Matt Moore, and he's a CTO of Chainguard, and he's tell us today about his journey of transitioning to leaving the biggest companies and joining his own venture, the new startup. Thank you very much, Matt. It's been a pleasure talking to you today. Over to you. Introduce yourself and tell us about the whole situation, all the scenario of everybody talking about right now.
Sure. Hi. It's great to be on. I'm Matt. I formerly of Microsoft a long time ago, and more recently, Google for many years, where I worked with Dan and Kim and Vile and Scott, my co-founders. And then Vile, Scott, and I also did a brief stint at VMware in the last year or so. So yeah. But the 5 of us have been sort of crossing paths and working together both closely as well as, on, adjacent teams across many projects and for many years. So I think I've been working with like Dan in particular for 6 or 7, maybe more years now. And it's hard to keep track of how many different projects we've collaborated on over the years. But really, all of us have been working together for a very long time. Most recently, Vile and Scott and I were all, very involved with Knative. Vile and I started Knative together, several years ago at Google. That actually also was another intersection with like Dan and Kim as well, because Tekton, which Dan and Kim were very involved with, sort of starting at Google, sort of was born in Knative as Knative build, and eventually sort of it grew enough substance sort of on its own as a thing that they decided to sort of break it out of Knative, and it became the seed of what is now Tekton Pipelines. So we've been working together, for many years now, and it's very exciting that we all sort of are coming together to do this startup, and we're already having lots of fun. But I think it's going to be a pretty fun ride for the next several years.
Yes, absolutely. This makes me really happy because everybody is talking about, because in the VM world, before the container, there's a VM. VM is isolated by nature, and you don't think about too much of the security. But containers is not by default secure. Everybody can hop into the container and underload the privilege access and then can do so much things, and containers are everywhere, and Kubernetes is scaling the container. So everybody talking about the container and security, and you guys just started up the Chainguard. I think this will revolutionize how we think about security today, and it will eventually ease our life, ease the developer and the operator's life of being securing the container. But we tell us, before we jump into the technology space, tell us about the whole journey, how you met the Dan during this time, how you met the Kim Lewandowski, when this conversation started, when you're thinking about this own initiative of Chainguard.
Yeah, so it's funny. So like back in March, between the pandemic and I'd been doing Knative for a while, and there's been tension on and off in the community between Google as well as the other participants around governance that I don't know. I don't like to talk about it. It just makes me grumpy. But there was this tension that was there. As well as, there was a lot of stuff going on at VMware because, Pivotal acquisition was closing. So there was a lot of sort of internal sort of churn around that as well. And so the combination of sort of a lot of those things, I was kind of like, I need a break. And so I left VMware. I sort of stepped away from the Knative community. It was actually a really reasonable time to step away because I had been on the technical oversight committee of Knative for a long time, and it was coming up on elections. And so I was like, okay, well, I just won't run for re-election and, leave it in someone else's capable hands. And, I'm not dying. So if they need something, they can always reach me. But, I'll sort of take a step back and make sure, focus on me and play video games. I bought a smoker. I've been smoking a lot of meats, and that was right around sort of the time vaccines started to roll out. So I also, not too far into my break, managed to get vaccinated, and then I could actually see people, and that was good after a year of the pandemic. So it was a good few months, but really after a couple of months of playing video games and just being doing nothing, right? Like I got itchy. Like I did better than I thought I would do about staying away from sort of tech things, but I love what I do. That's why I do it. So I have a pile of books here, things that I was poking at and trying to learn, like Rust and BPF and stuff like that during my break. But yeah, so I started to get itchy about like what I wanted to sort of be when I grew up, And so I started talking to companies, and I sort of think of it like I was interviewing the companies to find out like whether they were doing anything that I found sort of inspiring. And I met with a lot of companies, and there are a lot of companies with really interesting problems out there, big, massive scale migrations to Kubernetes, for instance, or, lots of companies that are building, trying to build good container platforms for their teams and stuff like that. And, all super interesting problems. But, nothing really sort of, there were things that I could see myself doing, but things that I didn't feel like, most of them were just sort of like, I didn't think they were going to sort of get me out of bed in the morning and be like super exciting. So I did start to talk to a bunch of, I was talking to companies of all sizes. So really big companies, the cloud vendors, for instance, which are some of the biggest companies in the world, as well as, super early stage startups, the whole spectrum. And so, I was talking to some startups as well, and that really got me thinking about the possibility of a startup. And, it's something that Scott and I had sort of kicked that around the idea of in the past, but I was sort of like, I hadn't really seriously thought about starting up because I always sort of appreciate the challenge of starting up. And I was like, I need a sort of CEO type. And I know that's not me, right? Like it's not who I am. I'm good at the technology, but like I need someone who's good at some of the other side of it. And some of the folks I've worked with in the past that, I thought might play that role if I were ever to start up were sort of otherwise occupied. But then I started to think about, Dan, and I was actually walking my dog and I texted Dan. I was like, have you ever thought about starting up? And I think Dan screenshotted this somewhere. And that is, I think, what really got the ball rolling because, it sounded like he was interested. I don't know if he was interested in doing it as sort of quickly as we ended up doing it, but I think it became pretty clear that as we started to actually talk about it, he was getting more and more and more excited about it. He and Kim have always worked very well together. And so he very quickly was like, Kim will definitely want to come in on this. And, I've been working very closely with Vila and Scott for years now. And I knew that they would, be very interested in this. And so we all sort of got together pretty quickly. And that's sort of how it all started. And everyone was pretty excited about it, the idea then, but like it's just grown as we've started to sort of get pieces together and whatnot. Since Dan and Kim were at Google for sort of a while after we began to talk about this, and Vila and Scott were at VMware. So for a little while, I was sort of walking alone in the forest. I was the only person who could write any code, and I refused to give anyone access to code until they had sort of, were free and clear from their jobs, just to make sure we were sort of, really good about separating like, any sort of IP from their current employers, since, wherever you work, sort of in big tech, right? Like they do IP assignments. So, we didn't want to, deal with any of that. So we sort of firewalled things by, I was alone for a while, then Vila and Scott came in. And then, Dan and Kim left Google, I think October 1st. And then they got access to the mono repo, and we've been having fun ever since. Well, we were having fun before that, but they couldn't, actively participate in the fun before that. So
yeah, absolutely. So what I see from in this year of March, you have met with Dan and you talk about this kind of revelation, because when I have a podcast with, I think on Dan Lawrence, he's at Google, and I think the month is August, the last week of August. And then I'm really happy that finally I met a person who've done a wonderful work at the Google, because he's a founder of Minikube, Tecton CD, and bunch of other very, very interesting projects. So I am thinking about what we are talking about these two stuff. And then after a few months ago, like as you mentioned of October, I see he tweeted out and left Google. And the next day he tweeted out, we started out their own company. That really, really surprises me a lot. But then I see like you and Kamil Lewandowski and the few bunch other people come up. And then what the appreciation from the community I think you receive, I think that's wonderful. Everybody is reaching out to you. Bunch of the people are already contributing to Project Sigstore and the cosign and bunch of other things happening. So before we're talking about the Project Sigstore and the cosign, tell us about the VM work you have done on the project. The Knative is a very interesting project right now. How the Knative started, what are the idea behind this project, and how long are you been into this project?
Yeah, so Knative has a sort of, now it's a surprisingly old project, yeah, so basically the way Knative started was, there are a bunch of container platforms at Google. GKE, I'm sure everyone listening to the podcast is aware of, because it was sort of the original productization of Kubernetes. And it's been around for many years now. However, right, like it took a long time before it was really sort of mature, proper, scalable thing for very, very, very large scale applications. And so there were some other sort of container-based platforms that emerged at Google sort of in parallel, where, where Kubernetes is sort of a Swiss Army knife that, the knife was getting sharper over the years, right? These were sort of scalpels. They were not designed to be general purpose solutions. They were sharp tools for specific jobs, sort of thing, right? And so there was in particular, a product team called App Engine. It went through many names over the years. I think the final product name was App Engine Flex or App Engine Flexible, where App Engine, is PaaS, you give it your source code and it runs that in a very scalable sort of serverless way. But it wasn't very flexible. There were a lot of sort of limitations of the sort of sandboxing environment they used to make that actually secure, multi-tenant, blah, 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 over the years. And so they used to use language sandboxes. Now they, use something that's similar to Cloud Run and uses gvisor sandboxing, and it's much more flexible. But, gvisor wasn't around yet. So basically, what the App Engine, the sort of origin of the App Engine Flex team was, can we replicate that on a VM-based infrastructure so that we can let folks bring sort of arbitrary code? And it started before Docker, but when Docker came onto the scene, they very quickly were like, we need to use that. But they were not building on top of Kubernetes. And so fast forward a few years, actually, the day before, I think it was the night before Kubernetes was announced, I'm pretty sure I sent mail to Brendan and Tomas, who eventually would be my boss. He was the TL for App Engine Flex. I sort of was like, we're going to get questions about like, what is this built on that? So like, we probably should start rationalizing that story. And my role in this at the time is I was starting Google's container registry, although I don't think it was announced for probably six or 8 months after Kubernetes was announced and GKE was announced. But yeah, lo and behold, one of the first questions at the App Engine Flexible talk at DockerCon 1 which was slightly after the Kubernetes announcement that Brendan and Craig had done. One of the very first questions was, is this built on that? And the answer was no, and Craig did a wonderful job of dancing. He got on stage because it was actually Kate Volkova giving that talk. But Craig got on stage and he did a great little dance where he dodged the question, but the answer was no. And so fast forward years later, Kubernetes is much more mature, and App Engine Flex is product. It's grown. It's got some big customers on it, but we needed to sort of rationalize container platforms at Google, and it was reaching the point where a lot of the feature requests that came in for App Engine Flex looked a lot like things that just existed in Kubernetes. And so basically, Knative started as something, I think its first name was something called Flexernetes, which was App Engine Flex on Kubernetes. And so it was really, this was the seed of what would become Knative Serving. And we basically prototyped something that would demonstrate basically request-based scaling on Kubernetes that might be a viable app abstraction for something App Engine Flex could build on top of. But that pretty quickly became a conversation about, well, can we have not just the sort of App Engine Flexible thing, but can we have like a proper serverless experience on top of Kubernetes? And there were a lot of folks exploring this at the time, kubeless, fission, OpenFast and whatnot. And we were sort of looking at across these things, and there were a few sort of coupling points that a lot of these systems sort of compromised on that we didn't want to compromise on, right? So, a few of them were like YOLO side loading into warm container pools, the application. We were like, well, we like having the container as the unit of packaging and pods being the execution unit, because big enterprises are investing heavily in things like admission control and policy checks around those primitives. And so we wanted to build on top of those primitives in ways that folks didn't have to completely rewrite their policy checking to work with Knative. And so that became sort of the separation of serving and build. And build was interesting because that's sort of the world I was coming from, container tools, where I worked a lot with Dan and company on alternative ways of building container images. Things, we were working on things like Jib and Co and Conoco and all of these things. We had something we called FTL that was doing, FTL was an acronym for faster than light, where we would assemble images using the container registry as a distributed cache. And we called it faster than light because there were certain images we could assemble faster than you could build them with a Docker file, and they would be published to the registry before you could do that. So if you viewed the fastest you could possibly build a Docker file as the speed of light, we were breaking the speed of light. And so that was the sort of origin of that name. So I've been working with Dan on that and a bunch of these other things. And the other thing about those that were interesting was they weren't using Docker, and so they were actually viable ways of doing on-cluster builds. And so that became sort of a seed for, you can do things like Knative build in a sane way because you don't need privilege. They're tarballs in JSON, and you can assemble them and write them to the registry. They can just be like any other workload you run on your cluster. And I think we, through that work and working with folks like build packs and whatnot, a lot of stuff is sort of traceable back to Knative build. We built things like the Go container registry library that sit under a lot of these tools, including things like build packs, build packs, Conoco, Co, all use that sort of library to assemble images, without Docker, without needing the daemon socket and access to, the node in order to build them. And so, so one of the things I pulled into the prototyping was we need a way of doing on-cluster builds using things like FTL or later Conoco and Co and whatnot, because part of a serverless experience to me is having sort of source-based thing, right? I've got a little snippet of code. I want to, there's some like proverb I'll butcher, but here's my code, go run it, right? Like go make it scale. But I like, my metaphor for serverless is it's basically presenting the illusion of infinite capacity while charging you for nothing but what you use, right? And so, a lot of folks think scale to zero is sort of the key thing, but really I think it's that abstraction. And it usually starts with this little piece of code that you want to, have go, right? And so Knative build was a key thing because we needed something that would create a container. And then serving did the request-based scaling. And then eventing came in a little bit later, but we knew we'd need it. But there was some fun organizational stuff at Google around, what team was going to do that and whatnot that led to it being, let's just say, delayed. But ultimately that came to be as well. And to me, right, like the source-based thing, right, and enabling things like higher level programming models like functions, right, are one piece of it. The request-based scaling is another piece of it. And then the killer application of request-based scaling and the function programming model is really event-driven architecture. So it's really three sort of very interesting things in their own right. But I think when you combine it to do things like event-driven architecture, it's, that's really the sort of killer app of these different technologies. And so that sort of this Flexor NetEase, it sort of went through a sort of evolution. It got renamed so many times. It was going to be called, it was going to be called Elafros. I think this was the name Oren had in mind. And I misheard him, and I was like, did you say Heliopolis? Because we were like across this big room, and he was like, no, but I like that more. So we went with that, but it turned out that the name Helios was in use by, I think Spotify had some sort of platform they were building. So it was too close. We went back to Elafros, which I think Oren had come up with because it was Greek for lightweight or something. And then that didn't really work as well for the sort of collection of things, which included build and eventing as well, because really the lightweight was, I think, more of a reference to serving. And so I don't know where Knative came from. I don't particularly like the name, but I think it's here to stay. And it's I won't say it's grown on me, but I've come to accept it.
Yes, wonderful. I do, during this conversation, I learned a lot that the candidate first name is Flexor NetEase. I didn't already know this. This is the information I get from you. That's a wonderful story you tell about, because in the podcast I've talked to many of the co-founder of the open source project, and they talk about the same thing, that the open source is a quite challenging and daunting. Also, when you want to run the business out of it, it's not a very simple model. Also, when you've learned about the Docker story, people are already shouting at the Docker right now. They are absolutely free, and right now they are charging for everything, like container registry to the Docker desktop, even for everything. We never expecting to do that. So another question from my side, because you have spent a huge amount of time in the open source, how do you look at the open source, and how you look at the open source business model, and what are your views on that?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So I mean, every single one of us is sort of a maintainer at heart, right? Like, we have spent a lot of time in the trenches of open source, and a lot of that time spent sort of chopping wood, carrying water for those projects. We respect the communities, and we want to make sure we do right by those communities. I think that said, though, we also want to be very intentional about our open source strategy. And we will be participating very actively in a lot of these projects, like Sigstore, Cosign, FullCO, because we believe in the mission of these projects, and we want to make them successful. I think where we'll be pretty intentional about our own open sourcing is around new projects that we start in the space. And part of that comes from sort of appreciating the challenge that goes into maintaining a project in the open, right? From governance to issue triage to blah, 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 right? It's a very, big thing. And like, you can, once you open source something, like, it's really hard to take that back. I mean, you get, not to pick on Microsoft, but you can see some of that with some of the drama that happened last week, right? Where, there's some feature that went all the way through RC1, and then it was like, no, we're gonna take this out. And it's like, well, you get a lot of ill will, and lots of folks have done this. So it's not just, Microsoft. There's stuff around like relicensing things and all this stuff. And so we just want to be very sort of thoughtful and intentional about stuff we put out that's new. I definitely think we want to, but we want to sort of figure out exactly what we want to be when we grow up before we do that. And some of that may mean we open source things a little later than we normally would. Personally, it's sort of very hard for me because I always want to share everything with everyone and demo things all the time, which, has been really easy when everything I do is in the open. But yeah, so I would expect to see us very actively in sort of the existing communities. And we may, in the not too distant future, open up some new things and maybe try our hand at creating new communities or moving those into some of these existing communities. But yeah, we're trying to be, very thoughtful and intentional about when and where we'll do that. So yeah, does that answer your question?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then the same question, because we're talking about the open source, and everybody right now is, because open source is everything, because when you into the part of the open source and the CNCF, this give you the ton of flexibility, everybody contributing to that open source repository, and that's it, getting the attraction of the larger audience. But I asked the same question to one of the co-founder of the Linkerd, that is William Morgan. I asked because on that day they are talking about the Istio versus Linkerd. Istio is backed by Google, and you are starting the Linkerd with a 1 or 2 person. How difficult is that? And the same question for you. People are right now investing a lot of money on the supply chain, the security stuff. You are the 5 of them, and rest of the community is so large. Is it how you can? It's not about the competition. It's about is it a dangerous journey? Is it a enjoyable journey? How this journey is it in your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some
in your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some differences from the Istio and Linkerd thing, but yeah, I think. I think in that case, right, it's sort of those are 2 projects which have different companies sort of commercializing around those projects and whatnot. I think there are a bunch of different things that I think will probably sort of work to productize more over time. But I think one of the and there's a whole bunch of projects like across the space that users really need to bring together in order to sort of secure their supply chain, right? I think that it starts with making sure that the open source projects that you're sort of cobbling together into that solution are on solid footing, right? So I think with things like Sigstore, so for pieces of it, there's some sort of other alternatives, right? So one that's worth plugging is Notary v2 versus say Cosign. There are similarities, there are differences. I think one of the things that I don't think Notary really touches on at all is the stuff around keyless signing, which to me I think is one of the most exciting aspects of what Sigstore is doing. Because the part of the way I look at it is managing keys yourself on your desktop, like, okay, use a KMS system, right? But using a KMS system, say from your build to get the key, sign things, and then throw out the key, your build machine or whatever, your build's control plane still gets that potentially long-lived signing key from the KMS system. So in Sigstore, there is a project called Fulcio, which is doing this, enabling this thing that's being called keyless signing, where instead of effectively fetching a key from your signing key from the KMS system and signing things with that and then disposing of it properly, you effectively use your workload's identity to go through a challenge process with the Fulcio server to get an ephemeral signing key. You generate the signing key and it sort of signs it into a sort of chain of trust, similar to, if you're familiar with WebPKI and sort of CAs, for securing the web and doing TLS, it's similar to that. There's a chain of certificates that are involved in the signing process. You sign with this cert that you've provisioned in memory, and you sign something with it, and then you throw it away. It never touches disk. And the key itself has an incredibly short lifespan. And so it's basically the equivalent of short-lived keys as opposed to short-lived, you've got short-lived credentials with things like access tokens or OIDC tokens that are best practice for credentials. But this sort of brings that to signing keys in a way that you can root things at a sort of root of trust in Fulcio, which becomes your sort of certificate authority for signing that makes it so that the workloads that are handling keys never have access to a long-lived signing key ever, right? Like it becomes this process where your workload that's doing builds can have short-lived credentials, only deal with short-lived keys, right? And you avoid attacks this way, right? So we've seen a lot of supply chain attacks where these long-lived credentials get exfiltrated and then used for nefarious purposes. But if the build process itself never had access to anything that lived longer than, ideally a few minutes, but, really maybe an hour or so would be okay, right? Like then your ability to sort of exploit that after exfiltrating it is very limited, right? You pretty much have to be actively exfiltrating these tokens in order to take advantage of it. And so I don't think there's really much in the space that really does what Fulcio is doing or what Recor, which is the transparency log equivalent to that, is doing. So to me, that's really exciting because it makes it so easy to do this, but also it actually, I think, makes it more secure because you're dealing with these short-lived things as well. So the metaphor that we used at the Sigstore booth at KubeCon, which I think is a really powerful metaphor, is Let's Encrypt, right? So Let's Encrypt basically tried to, take us from the world where like, okay, getting certificates, TLS certificates for your website, you had to go to a company who would give you something that was signed by a CA, and you might pay them a lot of money, right? But Let's Encrypt basically got, into the root CAs for, the internet, and they basically used that and a challenge process that is super cool, right? The Acme challenges, to enable folks to provision TLS certificates, painlessly, right? I mean, there's some pain if you run into quotas, but like it sort of brought TLS for the internet to a whole new level, right? Because it removed a lot of the friction and costs and things like that associated with getting TLS certificates. And so I think one of the goals of Fulcio is to effectively try and do that same thing for software signing. Container signing is one of the key things cosign does right now, but really, I think folks want to start signing a lot more stuff than that. And there's nothing exclusive about containers to something like Fulcio and Recor, right? They're just about provisioning ephemeral signing keys and having them rooted at some particular CA. And there's the public one, but I expect that a lot of enterprises will effectively run their own sort of root CA for their internal processes to root trust at that. And so, those are some of the pieces of this world that I'm super excited about, and want to help folks get into that world and bootstrap some of these pieces. But that's one piece, right? That's really just the signing piece, and signing isn't the ultimate goal, right? Signing's really just it's authentication, and it's really sort of authentication with no metadata, right? You want to authenticate claims and then have policy around those things, and this starts to get into going from signatures to attestations and then policy around attestations. But I think attestations will be the next thing once you've made signing easy. And then you start to talk about integrations really across the space. So So one fun example of this is Tecton chains. So and another thing to point out is sort of the SLSA framework, which is sort of complementary to this in many ways. So Tecton chains basically what it does is it monitors Tecton executions and records an attestation for any containers that were produced about exactly the set of steps that were run in order to produce that artifact, right? So this is interesting because it ties into the SLSA stuff around, there's a lot of talk of SBOMs and what goes in, but what goes into an artifact is sort of one piece of the sort of formula, right? Like if I were to give you the list of ingredients for a cake, right? And you just dumped them all in a bowl and shook it up or, did whatever, right? Like you wouldn't get a cake out the other end, right? You need to know the sort of steps that you go through in order to produce it. Otherwise you just have your icing and your eggs and your flour all mixed up in a bowl and that's not a cake. So, how the steps that were run, as well as, who ran them, when, and in what state, right? Like, if I'm the person preparing the cake, did I wash my hands that day or, that day, right before making it, right? So knowing who handled it, how it was handled, all of those things are really important as well. And so, the chains bit is trying to capture some of the sort of how it was handled, what the steps that were run from the inputs to the outputs were. And that's an example attestation that would get recorded with this stuff. And SBOMs are another sort of example of attesting to what went into the process of producing an artifact. But I expect more of these kinds of pieces of metadata will come out. And then there's already integrations around policy with things like OPA and Caverno to read this information out and gatekeep around what goes in versus what's policies a container has to satisfy to go in. And so lots of pieces. There were some really good presentations from so SolarWinds is the brand that's become synonymous with supply chain attacks, and they were sort of forced to address this by, when your CEO testifies in front of Congress, you get a lot of sort of funding internally to sort of address these problems. Trevor from SolarWinds did a keynote, I think, at the supply chain day, where he talked about sort of the pieces that they were putting together, and they were using Tecton and chains and some of the Sigstore pieces to do that. Michael Lieberman from Citi has been talking about some of his work on reference architecture across the sort of cloud native landscape to bring pieces together. And it also looks at things like Tecton and chains and some of the Sigstore components, as well as things like, I think he's using things like Spiffy and Spire as well for some of the sort of workload identity pieces. So there's a bunch of pieces that sort of will need to come together to form a complete solution. And so really our goal is to help folks get to that better spot, but also to, find ways to, over time, monetize pieces of this. But, I think that it'll always be in a way that's sort of API compatible with the projects we're interacting with, right? Like I don't want to say we were doing Tecton, right? Like I don't want to hide the Tecton API. Use the Tecton API. Maybe we, do something special that's worth paying for. In which case, pay us. If not, right? Like you use Tecton, and that's you could always leave us and go use Tecton, right? Yeah. So I'm rambling. So I cut myself up. If you have any.
No, wonderful. I think you explained a lot to me, because I'm thinking about right now is that we, as a CNCF landscape, created so much things like container orchestration engine, the policy engine, the networking. There are a bunch of new stuff. So then I think about, then I see the Project Sigstore, the cosine, the record, the Flossio. Then I'm thinking about my head in very intentionally. Do this Project Store is another umbrella where every security related tool reside into it. Is it the right way of thinking at this moment of time?
Yeah, so it's sort of funny to me. There's all these foundations, right? There's CNCF, there's CDF where Tecton lives, there's OpenSSF, which is I think where SLSA lives, and then Sigstore is actually not in any of them. The backstory I heard, and this could be completely wrong, was that they wanted potentially to home it with Let's Encrypt. And so it just got rooted under the Linux Foundation, which is really the foundation that manages all of the ones I mentioned. And I think they even debated calling it Let's Sign, but I think the Let's Encrypt folks were like, please don't. And so, there is some discussion going on about sort of, rehoming Sigstore under, I think, OpenSSF. But really, like, I don't understand any sort of tribalism across those sort of foundations. Really, to me, they are all sort of different parts of the ecosystem that are all interesting, and and they're all neutral and whatnot. And if they're not, poke me and I'll poke someone else. I mean, it was one of the fights that we had with Knative. Not that I'm looking for more of those fights because it's exhausting, but like we want to make sure that the projects run neutrally, and at least in the context of sort of trademark and IP and whatnot, right? Like Sigstore and all, anything rooted under one of those things is already neutrally owned, but like being neutrally run is another thing that we should be aspiring towards if we're not executing on that.
Yes, absolutely.
So yeah, and like I said, we're maintainers at heart, and we've hopefully if you look at what we've been doing over the past however many years, right, like that's the walk we've been walking. And so if there are aspects of any of these things that folks think could be more neutral and are not, definitely reach out, because I think my favorite example of this was when we went to make the Knative POC more neutral, right? Like one of the proposals was, okay, well, we don't want, because Evan, Vile, and I were all at Google, then we all went to VMware in a relatively short period of time. We wanted to expand the POC to be more, to open up more seats, but also to reach a neutral spot. And the original proposal was add 4 seats. And we were like, that's huge. 7 people, that's too big, right? And so we pushed back and we were like, no, like one of us will step down. That makes more sense for the project. And Vile was the person who, decided to fall on his sword, as it were, but like, we were all on the same page that like it made more sense for the project for one of us to step down in the spirit of neutrality, right? So hopefully, that and other examples over the years sort of are evidence of us trying to live and breathe these principles. But yeah, if there are places where folks think the projects can be more neutral, feel free to reach out to me or other folks. But
yes, absolutely.
And I'll do my best. I'm actually not in any sort of leadership position in Sigstore currently. I think I have. I'm a maintainer, but like so.
No, it sounds really interesting. You talk about all of these things. It's been a wonderful. But before I let you go, because I think the way the containers are being revolutionizing the development environments, I think I same way think about, because one of the poll I recently did was, are you interested about security? And everybody think this is the first step we're thinking about when we put stuff into the production. The only thing when we move to the production, we think about so 100% is about security. The reason why the companies and a small startup not did a lot of investment because it's a very painstaking task, as we talk about in the whole conversation. Rotating the key, rotating the sign certification, the PKI management, and there are the security. There are some individuals who have this responsibility to be secure your infrastructure, the platform, and they have 24/7 job for the people, and a lot of the startup are not going to manage this. And the way I work this cosign does is, I think, wonderful for the lot of development. You don't need to done anything. It's just a redo and undo process. You have to sign the image and then redo the signification and the verification. So it's a wonderful news for the developer. I think the OSS supply chain security is revolutionized the whole ecosystem, how we think about containers and the container ecosystem. So before I let you go, there are a few terms that are already confusing into the market. One is supply chain security, how we can define it today, the SBOM, and there are a few other. So before I let you go, can you describe these terms, how we can define these terms if somebody asks us to define it?
Sure. So SBOM, I'll start there. SBOM is effectively, it's an acronym for Software Bill of Materials. So the idea of a bill of materials isn't new, right? It's something that a lot of things have had to do for years, and it's sort of a shame that we haven't been forced to do that sooner as an industry, because I think there's a lot of sort of incidental SBOMs that a lot of container or really systems have included for years, right? And a lot of security scanners key off of these things like the Debian package database, or pick your favorite thing. It's sort of an incidental SBOM, but so SBOM, software bill of materials. Think of it like the ingredient list, right? Let's see. So supply chain security. Another one is zero trust. Zero trust. It's sort of like serverless, right? It's it's a buzzword thing. You will never reach zero trust. It's about minimizing the sort of roots of trust in your system, the number of folks that you're trusting. If you aren't, one of the analogies Dan likes to make is, you fetch dependencies from, all over when you're doing software today, right? Your GoMod transitively pulls in stuff from, who knows where. And it's in the moral equivalent of finding a USB drive on the sidewalk and plugging it into your computer. Except if you're running it in a container image, it's most likely worse, because you're running it as root, and you're maybe running it as root in your production system with access to your customer data or like customer payment processing. Like it's pretty frightening, right? And so basically the way I like to think about supply chain security is effectively giving users confidence that they know what is running where and how it got there. And so, the what I think is a big piece, right? Knowing that they are, you may not know something's bad yet, but you at least know what versions of everything are, in what runtime environments, and how it got there, right? Like there's examples of things like, the code cov exploit of the actual system being exploited to inject some sort of malicious thing. I believe the SolarWinds hack was something similar, where it wasn't something bad coming in through typo squatting or something like that. It was something injected by the processes that were handling it. There's actually a really fun KubeCon talk. I don't know if the recordings are up yet, but if they're up, it was John Johnson, who's a former colleague of mine, and Daniel Mangum from Upbound. John's at Google and Daniel's at Upbound. They gave a really fun demo of something that is a supply chain attack. It was part of the sort of main KubeCon tracks. But great demo, and I would recommend. I won't spoil it, but it was fantastic. Yeah, knowing what went in, right, where it's running and how it got there, I think are three really key aspects of supply chain security. And things like signing and whatnot are really a means to an end to try and capture that information, and in a way that folks can't sort of spoof who's saying what about these things. So
yes, absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely.
Did I miss any?
Yes, absolutely.
Any other?
Yeah. Absolutely. Just a wrapping up discussion, because the supply chain, I think that Dan is giving us a wonderful analogy. I think one of the interviewers did with Cube.net on the Silicon Angels. I think it did Kevin Lewandowski and Dan did an interview on the day of KubeCon, and I think we talk about this supply chain at the conveyor belt, where you place the box, and then the box is traveling through the conveyor belt, and you understand this is the traveling it takes. From step 1 to step 2, these things happening. Step 2 to step 3, these things happening, and when you actually end up into the destination, you understand, you can track the whole journey. In that way, you understand where the malicious activities can reside in, and you can secure your own infrastructure as well. But I think the wonderful talking to you. So there are just 4 minutes left for me. So just tell us about the Project Sigstore, which covers a lot, the full CO, the Racker, everything. Now the next step for you, the Chainguard. We are closing the year, I think. Out 2 months more remaining. What next for what next for the Chainguard? And is it the supply chain is for everyone, or enterprises, or the startups, or just for the Google, or just for the bigger companies? Who's thinking about critically about the supply chain security?
So everyone is thinking about this. I mean, it's pretty mind-boggling. So to put it in perspective, right? Like the way I think about it, right? Like software supply chain security is a problem that affects every software company, because every software company is producing software, and the vast majority of them is consuming like third-party libraries, or building on top of a platform that's third-party. It's hard to live that much in a vacuum today. Google's about as close as you can get. And part of the reason they helped start efforts like Sigstore is they still consume so much open source software. Something like 90% of what goes into modern software that's shipped, it was developed by someone who you didn't pay money to write it, right? So it really affects every software company. But the way the world has been shifting over the last, few decades, every company in the world is a software company. So I was talking to someone from a large paint company at I won't share details because I didn't ask them whether I could share, but there was a large paint company at KubeCon, and like they were concerned about their software supply chain, and so like it really is affecting everyone, right? Pretty much anyone who has any sort of software as part of their process, which is really everyone these days, because if you have a website where you sell stuff and handling payment information and have customer records and have inventory management systems, right? Like you have software that is potentially susceptible to attacks, right? Some folks are bigger targets than others, which I think leads to a greater sense of urgency for some folks than others. And so, I think the folks with the greatest sense of urgency are probably, the federal government, for instance, is very interested in these kinds of things, but, they've been very interested in it for a while. The financial sector is, they are definitely very active in the communities around this. I'd also think healthcare is pretty interesting because they're an interesting sort of attack target. But I think that, really anyone who provides software to any of those companies, right, is part of their supply chain. And so they, I think this is, where SolarWinds fits in, right? Like they were used as a vector to attack other things. And they were, a much smaller company who, like, you might not have thought would be a good attack target, but they became a jumping off point, I believe. Not all the details of the SolarWinds hack are public, but became a jumping off point for attacking their customers, right? And so, so it's a really interesting problem, and I think that it affects everyone, and so that's part of why I think we can't invest too much in open source, because even if we do, and like, okay, fine, many other companies emerge around the open source pieces that we've invested in and helped build. That's actually a good sign, because it's just too big a market to really for any one company to try and even go after. Like the tiniest fraction of this market would be a huge market for really any company. Because it's so big, it's just mind-boggling.
Yes,
how big
absolutely.
it is. So I think, but yeah, so but I think the way we sort of solve it and get as many companies sort of aligning around it as possible, and pushing that forward, that the solution to this forward is through sort of a standards-based approach, where we sort of agree on what the solution should look like, and we all help make that happen, and get folks onto that and make it as easy as possible to do these things, because you don't want to end up okay, I didn't adopt that because it was hard, or I worked around it because it was hard. And that really speaks to our mission as a company, right? We want to make the software supply chain secure by default, right? And by default doesn't mean like, okay, it's the default, but like it's painful, so you want to go turn it off, right? Like the best tools I've ever used made some sort of best practice the easy default way. And I didn't want to turn it off because I was doing the right thing and it was easy to do it, right? And so that's sort of our goal. We want to make having a secure software supply chain, the easy default way, so that you can get your work done without needing to worry about signing keys and so on and so forth. It just works and does the right thing, and you can focus on building value for your customers instead of what nation state actor is going to attack your supply chain, right?
Yes, absolutely.
To get access to your customers, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Scary times we live in.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much, Matt. It's been a wonderful talking to you. I think the whole goal is for easier for you to adopt the security practices. Right now, I think everybody is focusing on right now, and the few of them who are not just time to this, because this process is very painstaking and its process is time consuming. And with the new tooling like Project Sigstore, Cosign, I think that this process is not taking months or years to adopt, but it's taking just seconds to run a CLI command and you are up to go. And if you are interested about supply chain security, we have a CloudNative Islamabad is catching up with Jim Bagwadia from Kyverno, and will talk us about the supply chain security with Cosign and Cosign and Kyverno. I think go check that out. The chat is available here up in the link or might be in the description, and you can watch those sessions. I think this will give you the hands-on experience with what we already spoke about today. I think you are already being very interesting, enthusiastic about supply chain security. Follow Matt Moore on the Twitter, and he talk about all the ton of great stuff he's every day working on. He's sharing his knowledge with everyone. Every day try to follow him and learning new stuff, learning all the cool things happening today. And today I learned so many good things. The first thing I learned, the Knative is first recognized as Fluxer natives or App Engine and Flux. and many other things, the open source, how the Chainguard came into the picture, what are the process thinking behind, why the 5 people left and built out their own startup. So ton of good conversation with you. So before I let you go, the few words or few sentences and explain all the conversation to my audience, just in a few words.
Oh, we talked about so much. I'll part with this. We can't do it alone. Come, get involved with Sigstore. Find us on Sigstore Slack, or if you want to get involved in one of the other projects that we talked about, Tecton, Knative, right? All have fairly active Slack communities, and I'm sure every single one would love to have some new contributors or users, right? Like you don't have to actually send code in order to get involved. Sometimes feedback is the most valuable contribution you can make. So reach out if you have questions, but otherwise come help us fix the software supply chains.
Thank you very much, Matt Moore. It's been a wonderful talking with you today, and hope to join again in the future. And best of luck for your future endeavors. Hope you will find a wonderful success in moving forward in your journey with Chainguard and supply chain security. And the rest of us benefited from your products, benefit from your innovations, and benefit from your startup. Thank you very much. Hope to catch up you again soon. Bye-bye, Matt. That question, what was the science behind, or what was the thinking behind the name of the tool?
Behind Shipwright?
Yes.
I'm another good question. I'm not sure what other options they came up with. I think a shipwright is a person who builds ships, is a person who constructs ships. And there are a number of good puns in the community around other ship-related things. I think it took me an embarrassingly long time to realize that Shipwright was also a good pun for like ship right, ship correctly, ship your code right. It was embarrassingly long before I realized that was such a good pun. So well done to the folks that came up with that. Yeah. But again, before my time on the project, but I, again, very much heartily